Years ago, I want to say in the year 2005, there was this world history teacher that I knew. She was one of my teachers in high school. And she actually spent a good amount of time in Germany as a teacher. So she spoke German. And one day in class, she told us something that to me was disturbing, but at the same time revealing. And she told us that the youth in Germany, they're getting sick and tired of hearing about the Holocaust. And I found this to be quite revealing in regards to the political atmosphere in Germany and, the zeitgeist and how societies change, usually for the worst, sometimes for the better, but usually for the worst. And she was telling us about how the high school students in Germany, they're just sick and tired of hearing about the Holocaust. Like, they don't want to hear about it anymore, right? They hear about it every single year. They've been hearing about the Holocaust their entire lives. They're tired of hearing about it. And so the Holocaust, to a lot of people in Germany, has become annoying, tedious, and redundant. And what happens when this sort of thing occurs, right? What happens when you have this sort of psychological process into indifference? Doesn't matter how atrocious this historical act was, doesn't matter how evil, how genocidal, it doesn't matter, right? They hear about it every single year, and a lot of them are getting sick of it. What happens is that it's almost like reverse psychology. What happens is that a lot of people begin to praise the one who, for years, for decades, has been portrayed as the boogeyman. Hitler was a mass murderer. He orchestrated a genocide of millions of Jews, ethnic Poles, people with physical and mental handicaps, blacks. He slaughtered these people. There was a conspiracy, a plot to exterminate these people. And that should never be forgotten. The ideology that served as the motivation for these killings shouldn't be forgotten, and it should never be justified. And apologetics for that certain ideology, right? It really should never be accepted, right? It shouldn't. It should not even be tolerated. But what happens with people, and this is the problem with people, they hear about something over and over again, and then they're like, well, I'm so annoyed by this. And believe it or not, I mean, a lot of these people who are quote unquote annoyed by it, they have other things going on internally, right? They have maybe an idea of German supremacy. Maybe they want to see some sort of pan-Germanic ideology rise up. Maybe they want to see German nationalism surge. There's something going on internally. But instead of just saying what they really believe, they will say, well, talking about Hitler every single year is redundant, it's repetitive. We've heard it, right? We don't support Nazism, we're not Nazis, we get it. Germany is a new country, who cares? And so what happens in this whole process is the country, the society, begins to transition into a new zeitgeist. And usually when people transition into a new zeitgeist, it's not good, right? People begin to tolerate things that before were considered evil and egregious. People accept ideologies that are nefarious and insidious. People accept certain politicians and certain political parties that are dangerous. That's usually what happens. Great example, out of many, many examples, is the French Revolution, right? From being a monarchist country, it went into a revolutionary state, and hundreds of thousands of people were murdered, and from that chaos, you saw the rise of Napoleon, and he tried to conquer the world. And he didn't, thank God. Or else we'd all be speaking French. But that's what happens, right? And what I fear is that that is what's happening in Germany. Not just in Germany, but in a lot of other places in Europe where you have that sort of sympathy for ultra nationalism, right? Ukraine, Croatia, you see this sort of thing taking place. And it could actually be that one day Hitler is going to be seen as just another past European conqueror. He could be seen as just another Napoleon, right? He could be seen as just another Napoleon Bonaparte. And you never know. One day, maybe in the year 2050 or so, they'll have Hitler on the currency bill. You never know these things. You really never know. There is actually a video that I want to show you guys. It's from a guy. He was a professor. His name is Jason Giorgiani. This guy was a professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And he was fired from his job because of this video. And in this video, Giorgiani makes a prediction that pretty soon Hitler is going to be seen as a past glorious European conqueror, and Hitler's image is going to be on a currency bill. He actually makes this prediction, and he says that you're going to be seeing death camps in Europe, you're going to have a horrific war in Europe. Play the clip. Let's watch this.
It's going to end with the expulsion of the majority of the migrants, including citizens who have Muslim descent, generally speaking. That's how it's going to end. It's going to end with concentration camps and explosions and war that costed a few hundred million people. Let's put it this way. We will have a Europe in 2050 where the banknotes have Adolf Hitler, Napoleon Bonaparte, Alexander the Great. And Hitler will be seen like that, like Napoleon, like Alexander, not like some weird monster who's unique in his own category. No, he's just going to be seen as a great European leader. Now, like we say in English, you don't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
So you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. This is a very it's a very common American saying. Anytime when somebody in America wants to justify something egregious, they'll just say that. They'll say, "Well, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs," right? Like you can't do something great without killing a bunch of innocent people. And why do I think this is possible? There's actually a reason. And here's the thing. I don't like Giorgiani. Giorgiani is a Nazi. I mean, I've read about Giorgiani plenty of times. I looked at some of his work. He is essentially one of these pan-Indo-Europeanists who thinks that, because he's of Persian ethnicity, Persians and Western Europeans, all Europeans should unite together to fight against the war against the white man. And he has a lot of ties with Richard Spencer. And he is within that whole neo-racist circle, ideological circle, big on the occult, big on Zoroastrianism, paganism. He is an ideological Nazi. That's what this guy is. Although I don't think he calls himself a Nazi, he definitely has all of the trappings of one. Now, he's kind of like a modern-day Alfred Rosenberg, and he would probably take that as a compliment, but it's not. But here's the thing is, to a great extent, I don't disagree with what Giorgiani says in this video. I really do believe that there is going to be a horrific war in Europe, and it's not going to be some race war between French blacks and French whites, right? I don't think you're going to be seeing a land of the saints or whatever type situation. I think what's going to happen is, well, what has been happening in Europe for centuries, and that is a war between Europeans. I think you're going to be seeing the rise of Germany, and as Germany extends in its power, eventually you're going to see an implosion, and that's going to be violent. It's going to be like the 30 Years' War, the First World War, and the Second World War. And what do all those three wars have in common, other than their very, very high death count? All three of these wars were very ideological, and they centered on Germany. In the 30 Years' War, the majority of the fighting was in Germany. The majority of the fighting was in Germany. The Habsburgs were the other side of the belligerents. Of course, you had the Protestant side, you had all the German princes, and you had Bohemia that was involved, Sweden, Norway, Denmark was involved, and they were on the Protestant side of the belligerents. But then you had the Catholic side, and that consisted of the Habsburg Empire. And, that was centered where? In Germany, right? Germany and Austria. First World War, Second World War, both very ideological. Pan-Germanism was extremely central in the ideologies of the Austrians and the Germans. There was even this whole apocalyptic idea that there needs to be a war between the Germans, the Slavs, and the Latins, and the Germans would then dominate the Latins. And even before the 30 Years' War, you had ideas like that. There was a book, I don't remember the name of it, but it was a book that came out, I want to say in the 16th century, and it essentially said that there would be a war between the Germans and the Latins, essentially between the Northern Europeans and the Southern Europeans, and the Northern Europeans would win. This sort of thinking, you can see it continuously having this strong underlying influence in World War I and World War II, and to a certain extent in the 30 Years' War. This idea of the Protestants fighting against Catholic power, and that was, if you look at it, a lot of it had to do with the struggle between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. The Germans didn't want some guy in Italy to be having any sort of influence on their politics, any sort of influence on their lives. And they didn't get up and say, it's those evil Southern Europeans, but there was nonetheless this underlying idea that was in its inchoate stage, and it was germinating and growing. And so I think there is going to be a horrendous war. I think you are going to see genocide. He says it's going to be a genocide against anyone of Islamic descent. I actually disagree with that because you have a lot of Turks in Germany, and I think you will be seeing some sort of a mutual understanding between the European supremacists, or the pan-Germanists, and the Turks, because they're both European. I mean, to a great extent. Turks are mixed up with some Seljuk blood, but for the most part, these are like Islamized Greeks and Anatolians. During World War I, the Germans didn't have any problem working with the Turks to fight against the British and the French. But I think you are going to be seeing a nationalist surge that will end in horrendous violence and war. And I believe that if this whole way of thinking, if this exasperation regarding, talking about Hitler a lot, continues to intensify, eventually Hitler is going to become a national hero. Eventually, when all the World War II vets are dead, when all the Holocaust survivors have passed away, and you have this generation that is completely absent of anyone who lived during the Second World War, that whole spectrum of generations is going to be quite susceptible to being influenced by Nazis. Another reason why I believe this is because of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan slaughtered more people than the Third Reich. It is estimated by historians that the death count of the Mongol Empire was around 40 million people. Under the Mongolian Empire, China lost millions and millions of people. Like literally tens of millions of people died under the Mongolian Empire. Like this was during Genghis Khan's lifetime, when he was alive. Literally tens of millions of people in China killed. When the Mongolians invaded Persia, they say around 3/4 of Persia's population gone. The Mongolian Empire butchered tens of millions of people. Go read a modern-day book on the Mongol Empire, and you will hear about the violence. They'll talk about the conquest, but that's all in the context of empire, right? That's all in the context of somebody forging together a great empire. Talking about the violence of an empire doesn't necessarily condemn that empire or expose the evils of that empire, Because people today talk about Napoleon as though he was just some great leader, and they'll talk about how he defeated this person or this country and conquered this land and all that stuff. But again, it's all in the context of empire, and we can't impose our modern day way of thinking on people who lived in the Middle Ages, the 18th century, or the 20th century. No, we can't. We can't do that, right? This is a very common argument that historians utilize. And read a modern day book on Genghis Khan. They'll talk about, he made this great modern day mailing system. Oh yes, he made this wonderful system of diplomacy. He was actually very diplomatic. I remember years ago I found a book on the Huns. And in the introduction of this book, it talked about how, there are so many misconceptions about the Huns. The Huns, who were really another Turkic Mongol people, they weren't really that violent. There are all these stories of Huns drinking people's blood. That's all just propaganda. The Huns were actually amazing creators of empire. Attila the Hun had these wonderful diplomatic skills, and this is how modern day historians talk when they're talking about the Huns or the Mongols. Who's comparing Genghis Khan to Hitler? You'll find some books talking about it, but you have modern day books that praise the Mongol Empire, or they praise the Hunnic Empire. So yeah, pretty soon Hitler is going to be seen probably in the same light as we today see Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. You guys just heard some theology.